In the beginning, there were no empires, no marble temples echoing with debate. There was only a cluster of hills, 7 to be exact, rising from the marshy banks of a quiet river named the Tiber. Shepherds grazed there, flocks across the volcanic soil, and scattered farmers scratched meager furrows from land rich with potential, yet poor in comfort. No one looking at that landscape could have imagined what would come. And yet, from this modest beginning, mud-caked, raw, and restless would rise the most enduring force the Mediterranean world had ever known. But every empire, even the greatest, begins with a story. And Rome's story begins not with peace, but with blood. Not with unity, but with betrayal. They told of twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, born of a mortal woman and sired by Mars, god of war. Abandoned as infants along the Tiber's muddy shore. Left to die in the wilderness, they were spared by a sheave, suckled beneath her belly, warmed by her breath. Eventually, shepherds took them as their own, never knowing that these foundlings were destined to shape the world. As they came of age, the brothers decided to build a city. But they could not agree where. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill. Remus preferred the Aventine. Seeking guidance, they looked to the skies. Vultures circled overhead, omens from the gods. The argument, like so many in Rome's history, ended not in compromise, but in murder. Romulus killed Remus with his own hands, then built his city on the hill he had chosen. He drew a line around the sacred walls and declared them inviolate. Anyone who dared cross them, he warned, would die just as his brother had. It was a myth, of course, but it told a truth. That Rome was born not of harmony, but of violence. That fratricide was not just a crime, it was a foundation. The Romans would remember this. They would teach their sons that power was sacred, but it demanded blood. That loyalty was everything, and so the date of Rome's founding was fixed at 753 BC, a date remembered for centuries, not for what it was, but for what it meant. The act of Romulus, the divine murderer, was not just remembered. It was revered, a message carved into the city's soul. Power requires sacrifice, and the state comes before the brother. As the city grew, so did its memory. But behind the myth was a quieter, slower truth. Archaeologists today tell us that Rome did not erupt overnight. It emerged as a union of scattered settlements, slowly merging atop the surrounding hills. Trade, marriage, and necessity bound them together. They were influenced by older, more sophisticated neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, and the Greek colonies spreading along Italy's southern coast. From them, the Romans borrowed ideas, architecture, engineering, language, governance. But what they built with those ideas was something uniquely their own. They were not content to imitate. They transformed. The earliest rulers were kings, 7 of them, according to Roman tradition. Their names echoed through time, preserved in civic memory long after monarchy had become a hated word. Romulus was the first. More than a founder, he was a builder. He created the Senaton Assembly of Elders to advise the king and the foundations of clientage, that uniquely Roman system of loyalty between patron and client. He carved out Rome's identity not just in myth, but in law and ritual. His successor, Numa Pompilius, was a man of peace, a priest-king. He gave Rome its calendar, its temples, its sacred rituals. He taught the people that the gods were not to be feared, but bargained with. Religion, he taught, was a contract. Perform the rites, offer the sacrifice. Follow the calendar, and the gods would protect the city in return. But not all kings were so wise. The 6th monarch, Servius Tullius, transformed Roman society through a census, dividing the people not by birth, but by wealth. Those who could afford armor and weapons were given political power and heavier military burdens. It was a system that tied status to service, privilege to responsibility. The rich would rule, but they would bleed for that right. Then came Tarquin, the proud, the last king, arrogant, cruel. He ruled not with consent, but with fear. He ignored the Senate. He silenced opposition. And his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an act so vile that it would ignite a revolution. He raped Lucretia, noblewoman known for her virtue. In the aftermath, Lucretia called for her family. She spoke of her shame, then plunged a dagger into her chest. Her blood was more than tragedy. It was a spark. One man seized the moment Lucius Junius Brutus, a descendant of kings, now turned revolutionary. He lifted Lucretia's lifeless body before the people and shouted, "This is what monarchy has become. This is what unchecked power leads to." The people listened. They rose. They drove Tarquin from the city, and in 509 BC, Rome cast off its kings. But they did not replace the king with another. They did something far more radical. They abolished monarchy entirely. Power, they declared, must not rest in one man's hands ever again. Instead, they created a system of checks to consuls elected annually who could veto each other. A senate made up of Rome's elite to guide policy, and citizen assemblies where the people would vote on law and war. It was fragile. It was new. But it was something the world had never seen before republic, and yet, beneath its structure, lay old truths. Power was still sacred. The city still came first. The Romans may have dethroned their kings, but they had not forgotten the lessons of Romulus. The Republic would not be built on equality, or trust it would be built on structure, on ritual, on violence, if necessary. And so Rome's journey began, born in fire, forged in blood, guided by myths that were not quite false, and laws that were not quite just. What would follow was 2 centuries of evolution, compromise, and conquests that would turn the city of shepherds into a force that would reshape the ancient world. But that journey, Rome's real rise, was only just beginning. When the Roman Republic was born, it was less an act of renewal than one of defiance against tyranny, against kings, against the memory of Tarquin the Proud. Tarquin had ruled like a despot, ignoring the Senate, mocking tradition, and silencing dissent. His hands, once clean, became stained with blood. His son, Sextus Tarquinius, carried that legacy to its breaking point. What he did to Lucretia shattered any illusion that monarchy could still be civilized. It turned a city's silence into outrage. The people didn't just remove a king, they exiled a legacy. They swore an oath that no man would ever again rule alone. And thus, the Republic wasn't just a new system, was a bulwark against the past. But a republic is not born with strength. It has to prove itself worthy. And almost immediately, it was tested. The first threat came from the outside, from those who had once ruled over Rome and now sought to reclaim it. Tarquin fled to the Etruscan city of Clusium and persuaded King Lars Porsena to help restore him to power. The Etruscans marched on Rome, determined to crush the rebellion and reinstate the monarchy. What followed wasn't just a siege, it was a reckoning. And in the darkness of that crisis, Rome gave birth to legends. First came Horatius Cocles, the one-eyed warrior who stood alone on the wooden bridge over the Tiber as the enemy approached. He ordered the bridge destroyed behind him, with nothing but shield and sword. He held the crossing till the last plank fell, then plunged into the river and swam to safety. Arrows piercing his flesh. Then came Gaius Mucius, later called Scaevola, the left-handed, captured during a failed assassination of King Porsena. He thrust his right hand into the fire and let it burn, unmoving, as he told his captors that 300 Roman youths had sworn the same oath. Scaevola survived. The terror he inflicted did not. These stories, real or not, became the blood in Rome's veins. They taught every child, every soldier, every senator that courage, even alone, could match armies, that defiance could be sacred. The siege failed. Porsena withdrew. Tarquin never returned. But the Republic's enemies weren't just foreign. They were also within. Rome's revolution was noble in spirit, but imperfect in execution. Though kings were gone, power had not been evenly distributed. Aristocrats, the patricians now, held nearly every lever of influence. They filled the Senate. They were the magistrates, the judges, the priests. They claimed descent from Romulus' first 100 senators, and with that lineage came arrogance. They argued that they alone knew the sacred rites, the will of the gods, the traditions that bound Rome to heaven. Only they could conduct auguries. Only they could interpret omens. And in a society that believed the gods judged every law, every war, every marriage, that power was absolute. On the other side stood the plebeians, the commoners. They were the farmers, the craftsmen, the foot soldiers. Their blood defended Rome, but their voices were ignored. They could vote in the assemblies, but those votes were weighted to favor the wealthy. They could stand in the forum, but not propose laws. They could be tried in court, but under laws that were unwritten and interpreted only by patrician priests. Most offensive of all was the ban on intermarriage. A plebeian man could never wed a patrician woman, not because of wealth, but because of purity, religious purity, they said. The gods demanded it. But everyone knew the truth. It was about power. Rome had become a city of two nations, one that ruled and one that served. In 494 BC, the contradictions exploded. The Volsci and Aquifers mountain tribes raids into Roman territory. The Senate, desperate, called up the legions. But the plebeians refused. It wasn't a mutiny in the usual sense. No banners, no swords drawn, just absence. They walked away, thousands of them. Soldiers, smiths, shopkeepers. They marched to the sacred mount outside Rome and built their own camp, their own society. Not a rebellion, but a replacement. It was the first secessio plebis mass withdrawal of cooperation. Rome didn't know what to do. With no workers, the market collapsed. With no soldiers, the city stood defenseless. The patricians faced, with empty streets and silent fields, were forced to negotiate. The result was revolutionary. For the first time in recorded history, a government created an official whose job was not to govern, but to say no to the government itself. The tribune of the plebs, elected only by plebeians, answerable only to plebeians, with the power to veto any law, stop any magistrate, and protect the people from patrician abuse. The tribune's body was declared sacrosanct. To harm him was to commit a sacred crime punishable by death on the spot. Rome had institutionalized opposition. It was a radical innovation and admission that power required resistance, that checks weren't flaws in the system, but foundations of it. And yet, this change revealed something deeper. The plebeians hadn't demanded a new republic. They hadn't stormed the Senate or abolished the system. They wanted to be included in it, to join, not destroy. The struggle of the orders had begun. It would last centuries. A slow, grinding contest between privilege and inclusion, tradition and justice, and this first victory, the creation of the tribunate, was only the beginning. From it would come demands for written laws, for intermarriage rights, for access to high office, for the equal right to serve, to command, to marry, to govern. But none of it came without cost. Not long after, in the early 5th century BC, Rome faced another crisis, the problem of invisible law. The plebeians, tried in court, never knew what laws they were accused of breaking. They were held accountable to traditions they could not read. Patricians argued that to write the laws would anger the gods, that the sacred was not meant to be written, but justice demanded clarity, and the people demanded reform. The solution was the 12 Tables, the first written code of Roman law, inscribed on bronze and displayed in the Forum for all to see. It was harsh. Debtors could be enslaved, thieves executed, but it was law, known, fixed, no longer the private property of the elite. With the Tables, Rome took another step toward equality, not by eliminating power, but by illuminating it. And so the Republic endured. Not perfect, not peaceful, but evolving. Each conflict, each secession, each reform sharpened its identity. From the tyrant's fall to the tribune's rise, Rome was learning a truth it would carry for centuries, that power, unchecked, becomes tyranny, but power challenge can become a republic by the middle of the 5th century BC. The Roman Republic had won its first internal battles, not by swords, but by statutes. A government born from sacred murder had matured through secession, negotiation, and compromise. The kings were gone. The laws were written. The plebeians had a voice. And yet, the infant republic remained vulnerable, hemmed in by enemies, unsure of its future. The land around Rome was rich, and the people who coveted it were many too. The north lay the Etruscans, older, wealthier, and far more advanced in metallurgy, architecture, and organized warfare. To the south, the Latin tribes, former allies and frequent rivals, watched with suspicion as Rome reformed itself. Beyond them all, across the mountains, lurked the Volsci, the Aqui, and the Sabines, tribal peoples who raided lowland farms and vanished into the hills. Rome was a small spark in a vast darkness, and into that darkness the city would now march what Rome lacked in size or wealth. It made up for in something harder to define: will. It wasn't just the desire to survive, but the belief that survival was sacred, that their institutions were not conveniences, but covenants. They would fight not simply for land, but for law, for the Republic itself. When Tarquin, the proud Rome's exiled kingry, turned with Etruscan allies and laid siege to the city, it was not just a military attack. It was an existential challenge, a test of whether Rome's fragile republic could outlast the first serious threat to its very existence. In that siege, legend says, the gods favored the brave. Horatius Cocles stood on the bridge over the Tiber and held it alone against waves of Etruscan warriors. Behind him, his comrades tore up the planks, denying the enemy entry. With his shield raised and his spear flashing, Horatius fought until the last beam fell, then leaped into the river, wounded, and swam to safety. His stand did more than delay the enemy. It inspired the city. Then came Mucius Scaevola, captured during an assassination attempt on King Lars Porsena. He was brought before the enemy court. To prove Roman resolve, he thrust his right hand into a fire and let it burn without flinching. The king was stunned. Mucius earned the name Scaevola Lefty, and he was released. Porsena, shaken, withdrew. Rome had passed the test not just militarily, but spiritually. The people had shown they would die for their republic before kneeling. To a king, these tales, whether history or myth, became sacred scripture in the civic religion of Rome. The Republic was more than a state, it was a moral idea. Every Roman was taught that they were heirs to this virtue, that courage mattered more than survival, that pain was irrelevant when honor was at stake, that the walls of the city were defended not just with spears, but with sacrifice, but survival would require more than heroes. It would demand strategy. In the wake of the siege, Rome realized that its long-term safety could not rest on courage alone. Alliances would be key. Diplomacy would be a weapon equal to any sword. And so, in 493 BC, the Romans negotiated the Foedus Cassianum, the Treaty of Cassia, with the Latin League. Rather than conquer its neighbors, Rome chose cooperation, a military alliance built on mutual defense. Each city retained its independence, but agreed to fight under unified leadership. It was a simple idea with revolutionary implications. You don't need to rule everyone directly to build an empire. You only need their loyalty. This principle alliances over occupation would become the cornerstone of Rome's expansion. As the Republic grew, It would offer defeated foes a choice, ruin or partnership. Most chose wisely, but alliance was not peace. The mountain tribes to the east, Volsci and Acqui, did not want Roman partners on their borders. They launched raids on Roman territory, burning fields, attacking outposts, and retreating into the hills. It wasn't a war Rome could win quickly. It was a slow, grinding contest of endurance. Each season brought new skirmishes, each year more blood. Rome's citizen soldiers, farmers, potters, smiths were pulled from their fields and thrown into constant campaigning. Crops went unharvested. Homes fell into ruin. But the Republic endured. The wars didn't yield glory. They yielded something more valuable. Resilience. Rome learned to fight not just decisive battles, but wars of attrition. They built roads to move faster, outposts to hold territory, alliances to share burdens. They expanded not in surges, but in steps, and each enemy that fell didn't disappear. They were absorbed. Rome's secret was its ability to turn foes into friends. After defeat, cities were offered varying degrees of citizenship, some full with a right to vote and hold office, others partial with trade rights and protection, but without political voice. The message was clear. Loyalty brings rewards. Rebellion brings ruin. This graduated system created incentives for peace. A defeated city didn't become a slave, became part of something larger. Something Roman. In time, Rome's armies began. To reflect this diversity, we no longer marched just as sons of the Tiber, but as a confederation. Latins, Sabines, Unicial, fighting under the banners of the Republic. But even as Rome grew stronger, it remembered the pain of monarchy. And so, it created a safeguarder tool to defend the Republic without becoming what it hated. The office of dictator. In times of existential crisis, when war threatened to overwhelm the slow machinery of government, the Senate could appoint one man with total authority, but only for 6 months. It was power with a fuse, enough to save the Republic, not enough to end it. The dictator was a paradox, absolute in command, but temporary in tenure. He was expected to win, then vanish, to hold greatness and then relinquish it. It worked. The system endured. But Rome's survival wasn't just about systems. It was also about faith. Religion, in the Roman mind, was not abstract. It was transactional. The gods offered favor, but only if the people performed rituals correctly. The Republic's priests, known as pontiffs, became custodians not only of ceremony, but of constitution. Every oath sworn to the Republic was also an oath to the gods. To betray the law was to invite divine wrath. Civic disobedience wasn't just a crime, was sacrilege. This blend of politics and piety gave the Republic spiritual armor. Institutions became sacred. Authority was holy. Rituals reinforced power. And power reinforced belief. But Rome's pragmatism always tempered its faith. When the kings were expelled, they left behind administrative gaps. They broke the old monarchy in two. Many offices, praetors, handled courts. Censors counted citizens. Aediles managed markets and public works. No single man could know or control it all. Power was fragmented by design. Every office was a cog in a greater machine. It was not chaos. It was protection. And so the Republic marched on, not flawless, not serene, but unbroken. It had survived. Siege, rewritten its laws, forged alliances, fought endless wars, and in doing so, it had become something rare in history. A system that could evolve, rather than snap. But evolution is never easy. Just over the next horizon, the Republic would face its greatest tests, yet ones not from without, but from within, where the enemies would not be raiders or kings, but the very citizens the Republic was built to serve. The world outside was still full of threats, but inside, beneath the marble of the Forum, the cracks were beginning to form. Rome, by the early 5th century BC, was a republic in name, but still a battleground. In truth, the kings were gone. The Senate ruled. But not everyone who bled for the Republic was allowed to shape it. The patricians, the old, aristocratic families, still held the sacred offices, controlled the land, and monopolized justice. Their ancestors had walked alongside Romulus. Their sons filled the priesthoods, judged the laws, and spoke for the gods. The plebeians, the common people, plowed the fields, served in the legions, and raised the walls of the city. But they held no priesthoods. They could not marry into the patrician class. They could be tried, but not judge. They could die in war, but not command. Their bodies served the Republic, but their voices were excluded from it. It was not slavery, but it was something crueler, sanctioned silence, and yet the plebeians endured. They hoped. They waited until hope gave way to action. In 494 BC, the pressure erupted. The mountain tribes, the Volsci and Aquions, again descended from the hills, threatening Roman land. The Senate, as always, called for legions. But something was different this time. The plebeians refused. They did not riot. They did not draw blades. They simply walked away. Tens of thousands of them left the city and marched to the sacred mount. There, outside the walls of Rome, they made camp. No laws, no consuls, no patricians, They built fires, organized leadership, and declared they would not return until something changed. This was no rebellion. It was a secession, and it shook the city to its foundations. Rome, without its plebeians, was nothing. No army, no grain, no labor, no future. The Senate panicked. They sent envoys, tated. And for the first time in Roman history, the patricians had to listen. The plebeians had a simple demand: protection, not vengeance. Not revolution, but protection. The result was something new in the history of governance: a political office created not to serve the state, but to resist it. The tribune of the plebs. These officials were elected solely by plebeians. They had the power to veto any action by a magistrate, any law by the Senate, any judgment passed in court if it harmed the common people. Their power was not just political, it was sacred. A tribune's body was sacrosanct. To strike one was to invite death. Their word was shield and sword alike. The tribune was not a ruler. He was a guardian, and Rome had never seen anything like him. But the tribunate was only the beginning. The plebeians had tasted influence. Now they wanted equity. The next battle was for justice. For centuries, Rome's laws had lived not in books, but in memory, spoken, interpreted, and enforced by patrician priests. If a plebeian was accused of a crime, he stood before a court whose rules he could not read, whose rituals he did not know, whose judgments were cloaked in secrecy. This was not ignorance, it was engineered inequality. The plebeians demanded transparency. Justice, they said, must be written, known, shared. The patricians resisted. They argued that laws were divine gifts from the gods. Writing them down would offend the heavens. But beneath the piety was fear. They knew if the people knew the law, they could use it. After years of pressure, the Senate relented. In 451 BC, 10 men, the Decemviri, were appointed to write Rome's first legal code. They produced 10 bronze tablets. The next year, 2 more. The 12 tables post in the Forum for all to see. They were the beginning of Roman law as we know it. The laws were harsh. Debt could mean slavery. Theft could mean death. But they were clear, and they applied to all citizens. This was equality, not of kindness, but of knowledge. Now the plebeians pushed. Further, they demanded the right to intermarry, the Lex Canulea of 445 BC ended the ban on marriage between patricians and plebeians. This wasn't just about love, which is about legacy. Children of mixed unions could inherit both religious status and political opportunity. It was the slow erosion of caste, the first breach in the walls of hereditary privilege. But still, the highest office in Rome, the consulship, remained closed. The patricians argued that plebeians could not offer sacrifices to the gods, that the republic's fate required pure bloodlines in command. The people knew better. They had led in war, bled in defense. They demanded access. The compromise was the creation of new magistrates, military tribunes with consular power. These officers could be chosen from either class. In form, it was a concession. In truth, it was a proving ground. Plebeians now held near consular authority. And with every campaign, every trial, every decision they showed they were equals. The pressure built in 367 BC. The Lex Licinia Sextia broke the final barrier. One consul each year must be a plebeian. It was not symbolic. It was seismic. For the first time, a common man could command Rome's armies, govern its laws, lead its people. The doors of the Republic were no longer closed, and the flood began. Plebeians became praetors. Managing courts, they became censors. Overseeing morality and census, they entered even the sacred colleges of priests. Those once untouchable bastions of patrician purity. With each law, each appointment, each ritual rewritten, the old world cracked further. The final blow came in 287 BC. The Senate had long claimed that laws passed by plebeian assemblies, plebeians, but the plebeians knew power without universality was theater. The Lex Hortensia ended the fiction. Henceforth, all laws passed by the people bound the entire republic. No exceptions. No escape. The struggle of the order's centuries of silent resistance, public protest, legal reform had come to an end. Rome was no longer an aristocracy with a voting class. It was something closer to a republic in truth, but victories always come with a price. The republic had been forged in the fires of conflict, not just external war, but internal negotiation, and it had adapted again and again. That was Rome's genius. But behind that adaptability was a deeper truth. The Republic had grown because it was simple. It was a city. A few thousand citizens, some hills. A river dot. Now it ruled Italy. Its system born, for a village was straining to manage a peninsula, and worse. New problems were on the horizon, ones no tribune could veto, no consul could command, and no law could legislate away. Wealth was pouring in. Inequality was rising. The farmer-soldier was disappearing. Foreign lands were being conquered, but who would govern them? The plebeians had risen. But now, new forces would rise in their place. The Republic had survived the kings. But could it survive success? The Roman Republic, now firmly in the hands of both patricians and plebeians, had reached a new phase in its evolution, not just one of law, but of class and ambition. For over a century, the struggle between orders had reshaped Rome's government. Each reform was a crack in the old patrician dominance, each law a stairway by which the plebeians climbed toward equality. And yet, even with both classes sharing power, true unity remained elusive. Because Rome had not become peaceful. It had become political, and politics in Rome was war by other means. Now, the contests moved into the forum, the Senate, the assemblies where voices could wound, and rhetoric could rally crowds as swiftly as swords once did. At the heart of this tension was the Roman obsession with dignity, reputation, honor. It was the currency of political life. Men of both classes now vied for the same offices, the same glory, the same triumphs. With patrician monopoly broken, status had to be proven in not inherited, but earned. The Republic was turning into an arena, and every citizen a spectator. The lines between the old orders blurred. Some patricians grew poor and faded. Some plebeians, like the Claudi and the Latineros, so high they became nobiles, the new elite. A patrician name meant less than a record of service. The people began looking not at bloodlines, but at deeds. And that brought new tension, because even as the legal war between classes cooled, the social war within the ruling elite burned hotter. The race for glory, the cursus honorum, or course of honors, had become formalized. Young Roman nobles now followed a structured path, first quaestor, then aedile, then praetor, and finally, if fortune favored them, consul. Each office was a test of prestige, and each came with higher stakes. As Rome expanded across Italy, so too did the rewards of office. Governors began to collect taxes, distribute contracts, and influence entire provinces. Magistrates controlled armies. A successful general could return home with triumphs, riches, and dangerous popularity. This was no longer the republic of one city. It was becoming an empire of opportunity and ambition. Once bounded by law, began to twist those laws into tools. One of the first signs came in the early 4th century BC. The Licinian sexton reforms had required one consul be plebeian, but no such requirements apply to other offices. Patricians now tried to dominate the praetorship and censorate, blocking plebeians through procedural tricks and manipulated elections. In response, plebeians passed new laus legis, genusae, and Ogonium, undating access to priesthoods and curbing simultaneous office holding. Power, they argued, had to circulate, not concentrate, but every law they passed became another move. In a deepening chess match, nowhere was this more obvious than in the tribunate, originally a weapon of the people. The tribune's veto had become a tool of faction. Senators, both patrician and plebeian, sought control over tribunes, using them to block rival legislation or protect their allies from prosecution. The tribune, once a bulwark against abuse, had become a partisan dagger. And yet, Rome still functioned. Because beneath the posturing and delay, the city kept growing. The Republic extended its authority across the peninsula. It brokered treaties, built colonies, paved roads. It absorbed defeated peoples not as slaves, but as allies. The Socio-Italian allies were granted local autonomy in exchange for troops and loyalty. Rome's legions, cones made of her own sons, were now a coalition force: Latins, Samnites, Etruscans, Umbrians, all fighting under the red banner of the Republic. But with growth came pressure. Land became the flashpoint as Roman soldiers conquered territory. The state claimed large tracts as ager publicus, public land. These lands were to be redistributed, but in practice, wealthy patricians and plebeians leased them at low prices, often for generations. They turned public fields into private estates, small farmers especially. Returning veterans could not compete. Debts rose. Foreclosures followed, and as families lost their land, they migrated to the city, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. The Republic was becoming rich in conquest, tan poor in equity. This crisis was no longer about class, but about structure. The citizen soldier, the man who farmed in peace and fought in war, was being replaced. The new republic demanded more legions, longer campaigns, and broader borders. But fewer Romans could meet the property qualifications to serve. Rome was building an empire with an army it was slowly disqualifying. And the solution was yet to come. Amid this imbalance, one institution grew more vital. The censor. Censors held no military command. They did not propose laws, but they did something more powerful. They defined who counted every 5 years. They conducted the census, counting citizens, assigning property classes, determining Senate membership, and overseeing public morality. A censor could elevate a family or destroy it. They could expel senators, strip knights of rank, or declare men unfit for duty. They didn't need trials, only judgment. It was the invisible hand of Roman virtue, feared, respected, and critical. But not even censors could halt the deeper transformation. As Roman society tilted toward oligarchy again, A new kind of politician emerged, one who claimed to speak for the forgotten. Some were sincere, others opportunistic, but all would eventually realize the same truth. To change the Republic, you must break its rules. We'll bend them until they screamed. That day had not yet come, but it was approaching, and in the meantime, Rome turned outward toward the conquest of the Italian heartland, what the city could not solve at home. It sought to balance with victory abroad, because in Roman eyes, conquest justified hardship. Glory softened inequality, and as long as the legions marched in triumphs paraded through the streets, the people would endure. The orders had collided, but the collision had not destroyed the Republic. It had, instead, forged it into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. But now, a new enemy approached, one unlike any Rome had yet faced. Across the sea lay Carthage, and with it, the beginning of the greatest war Rome had ever fought. A war that would not just test the Republic, but redefine it. By the early 4th century BC, the Roman Republic had grown beyond its village roots. It had navigated the collapse of monarchy, endured centuries of class conflict, and forged a complex web of laws, offices, and alliances. But for all its internal transformations, Rome still existed in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Italy was no empty land waiting to be ruled. It was a battlefield, a fractured patchwork of tribes, cities, and cultures. Etruscans ruled the north with their ancient cities and sacred auguries. The Samnites controlled the highland center, fierce and mobile, with warrior kings and decentralized clans. Greeks colonized the south, a region the Romans called Magna Graecia, with art, philosophy, and phalanxes, and scattered across the plains and mountains were tribes like the Volsci, Aqui, Umbrians, and Sabine, some allies, many enemies, taught to survive. Rome would have to conquer. To conquer, it would have to adapt. And adaptation would become its defining trait. The path to dominance began with one name. Vigue. Vigue was Rome's mirror in a Etruscan city just across the Tiber, equal in wealth and ambition, watching Rome with wary eyes. The two cities had clashed for decades in minor raids and border skirmishes. But in 406 BC, it turned into full-scale war. It would last 10 years. Rome laid siege to Veii in a display of determination never before seen. The army did not disband for the winter, as was customary. They stayed year after year digging trenches, cutting supply lines, and building earthworks. It was a war of attrition. Then, in 396 BC, the Romans dug a tunnel beneath the walls, and in a coordinated assault. They breached the city from within. Veii fell. Its people were enslaved. Its lands were annexed. The victory was Rome's first taste of total conquest. But it came with a new challenge. What to do with the conquered? Rome's answer was brilliant. Instead of razing Veii completely or ruling it as a colony, they offered its lands to Roman citizens. New settlers were granted property. The spoils were distributed. And most crucially, Vesuvius' territory was absorbed into Rome's political structure. This was not just expansion, it was assimilation. But even as Rome looked outward, disaster struck from beyond the known world. In 390 BC, a people the Romans called the Gauls swept down from the north. They were tall, ferocious, and alien, speaking an unknown tongue and wearing strange armor. They descended on the city like a force of nature. At the Battle of the Allia River, Rome's legions were shattered. The survivors fled. Days later, the Gauls entered the city. They burned its temples, homes, records to Ashdod. Only the Capitoline Hill held out. For months, a handful of defenders resisted atop the sacred hill. Starving but unbroken, legend says that as the Gauls attempted a nighttime assault, a flock of sacred geese kept in the temple of Juno began honking wildly. Their cries woke the guards. The assault was repelled. Eventually, the Romans paid a ransom 1,000 pounds of gold and the Gauls departed, but the scars ran deep. The sack of Rome was not just a humiliation. It was a revelation. The city had no walls. Its army had been unprepared. Its institutions, for all their complexity, had failed to protect the people. Rome would never forget. From the ashes rose a new obsession: security. They rebuilt not just their homes, but their entire approach to war. City walls were reinforced. The army was restructured. Military training intensified. New colonies were founded in strategic locations across Italy to serve as forward outposts. The trauma became doctrine. Rome must never be vulnerable again. This new Rome turned to its next great enemy, the Samnites. The Samnites were everything Rome wasn't: tribal, decentralized, and mobile. They dominated the central Apennines and had access to rich resources and warlike manpower. The First Samnite War erupted in 343 BC. It was brutal and indecisive, but it was only the beginning. The Second Samnite War, begun in 326 BC, was a crucible. Rome suffered humiliating defeats. At the Caudine Forks in 321 BC, an entire Roman army was trapped and forced to surrender. The Samnites made the Romans pass under a yoke of Sparta, symbolic act of subjugation. Rome was humiliated, but it did not forget. It reformed again. Roads were built, not just for trade, but for war. The most famous, the Via Appia, running from Rome to Capua, allowed legions to move swiftly through hostile territory. Logistics became strategy. New colonies were planted. Not mere settlements, but militarized hubs filled with veteran soldiers, each ready to defend the republics. Interests far from home, Rome developed the manipular leguna, more flexible, modular army formation that outmaneuvered the rigid Samnite lines. Slowly, the tide turned by 300 for BC. The Second Samnite War ended with Roman victory, but the Samnites would rise again. The Third Samnite War, 298 to 290 BC, became the final reckoning. The Samnites rallied other Italian tribes to their cause, the Etruscans, Umbrians, and even the Gauls. It was a coalition of desperation, but Rome had changed. At the Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC, Rome deployed its full might. The fighting was fierce. At one point, a Roman consul Publius Decius must charged into enemy lines and sacrificed himself in a ritual called the Devotio, dedicating his life to the gods of the underworld in exchange for victory. The army, inspired, broke the enemy. The alliance collapsed. With that victory, Rome emerged as the undisputed master of central Italy, but the south remained there. In Magna Graecia, Greek cities thrived rich, cultured, and sophisticated. They watched Rome's rise with growing unease. When the city of Tarentum clashed with Rome in 282 BC, it summoned a champion from across the sea, Pyrrhus, a cousin of Alexander the Great. Pyrrhus arrived with war elephants, professional phalanxes, and dreams of empire. His victories at Heraclea and Asculum were devastating, but they came at a cost. His army suffered massive casualties. After Asculum, Pyrrhus reportedly said, "Another such victory, and we are lost." Hence, the term Pyrrhic victory in 275 BC. He withdrew. By 272 BC, Tarentum fell, and with it, the last major resistance in Italy collapsed. Rome now ruled the peninsula from the Po Valley to the tip of Calabria, but conquest had changed the republic. Rome had gained land, wealth, slaves and enemies. It now ruled peoples with different languages, customs, and loyalties to maintain control. It developed a web of alliances, partial citizenship, military colonies, and brutal suppression of rebellion. It was not peace. It was order. The republic was no longer city-state. It was a machine, efficient, ruthless, expanding, and just across the sea. Another machine was stirring, a rival that commanded vast fleets, vast wealth, and its own vision of dominance. Carthage, what had begun as a war of survival on the hills of central Italy, would soon become a world war fought not for land or law, but for existence. The Republic was ready. Its next chapter would be written in blood and salt, on land and sea. In one of the greatest conflicts the ancient world would ever witness, the Punic Wars were about to begin. Rome had conquered central Italy through grit, reform, and relentless war. The Samnites had been humbled, the Etruscans subdued. Roads crisscrossed the land, colonies anchored Rome's authority. From the smoky fields of Veii to the rugged heights of the Apennines, the Republic reigned. Grew thick and temples glistened with marbleae, a different Italy. Magna Graecia, there. Greek culture had flourished for centuries. Cities like Tarentum, Croton, and Sybaris had been founded by seafaring colonists, bringing with them the ideas of democracy, coinage, architecture, and the hoplite phalanx. Their people read Homer, sculpted in marble, and debated in public squares. To them, Rome was still a rustic power, resolute, yes, but coarse, and barely civilized. That illusion would soon collapse. In 282 BC, Roman warships entered the Gulf of Tarentum, violating a previous treaty. The act may have been deliberate, provoked. Tarentum, proud and fiercely independent, attacked the Roman fleet and expelled a Roman garrison. War was inevitable, but Tarentum knew it couldn't face Rome alone. So it called for aid from across the Adriatic Sea. Enter Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus of Epirus was no mere mercenary. He was a cousin of Alexander the Great, a descendant of Achilles, and one of the most ambitious generals of his time. He dreamed of empires stretching from Greece to the Western Mediterranean, saw in Italy a stepping stone. When Tarentum called, Pyrrhus answered. In 280 BC, he landed in southern Italy with 25,000 men, including war elephants beasts, never before seen on Italian soil. His army was hardened, drilled in Macedonian phalanx warfare, and backed by experienced commanders. Rome met him at Heraclea. The Romans fought, as they always had, aggressively, stubbornly, and without fear. But Pyrrhus's tactics, combined with the shock of elephants charging into the Roman lines, shattered the legions. Thousands died. The Roman line broke, but Pyrrhus did not celebrate. The casualties were enormous, 7 among the victors. Pyrrhus had lost irreplaceable veterans. And, unlike Rome, which could draw on a vast network of allied manpower, Pyrrhus had limited reinforcements. He marched north, hoping Rome would sue for peace. Rome refused. The Senate, advised by the elderly Appius Claudius Caecus, stood firm. Rome does not negotiate under threat, he said. Tell Pyrrhus to leave Italy or prepare for war. Pyrrhus tried again. He sent envoys. He offered Rome generous terms. But Roman pride ran deeper than fear, and so Pyrrhus met Rome again. The Battle of Asculum in 279 BC. The result was the same, a costly Greek victory. Again, elephants trampled legions. Again, the Roman lines collapsed slowly, not in panic, but with deadly resistance. When asked how the war was going, Pyrrhus reportedly sighed. Another such victory, and I am undone. It was here that history coined the term Pyrrhic Victoria. Win so costly, it becomes indistinguishable from defeat. Even in defeat, Rome was winning. Pyrrhus now looked elsewhere. In 278 BC, he sailed to Sicily, hoping to replace Carthaginian influence with his own. At first, he succeeded, driving the Carthaginians from key cities. But Sicilian politics proved volatile. The Greeks who had welcomed him began to resent his autocratic ways. Revolts broke out. Carthage counterattacked in 275 BC. Pyrrhus returned to Italy, but he returned weakened, with a smaller army and fewer allies. Rome met him one final time, met Veneventum. There, Roman legions, better prepared for elephant warfare, held firm. Pyrrhus's army faltered. His Italian campaign ended in failure. He returned to Epirus, defeated not by a general, but by a system that was Rome's genius. It could absorb defeats and still grow stronger. It was a state designed to regenerate through its citizen soldiers, its allied manpower, and its political resilience. By 272 BC, Tarentum surrendered, and with its fall, Rome completed the conquest of the Italian peninsula from the Arno River in the north to the Strait of Messina in the south. But this victory was different. It marked the transition from regional power to Mediterranean contender. Rome now ruled Greeks, Oscans, Samnites, Latins, Etruscans, Umbrians, and more. Dozens of languages, a patchwork of religions and traditions. The Republic was no longer a city-state, was Ahen. To govern this vast realm, Rome did not impose uniform rule. Instead, it wove a complex web of treaties. So were granted local autonomy, but were required to send troops when called. Many were denied voting rights, but given Roman protection. Citizenship became a layered concept. Some cities received full rights. Others were given partial citizenship. No vote, but legal protection. Still others remained allies in name, yet deeply dependent. This flexible system allowed Rome to rule vast lands without stretching itself too thin. But it also sowed seeds of resentment. These allies, though loyal in war, began to notice that they bore the burdens of conquest without enjoying its fruits. That tension would simmer for generations, and one day it would boil over. But for now, Rome stood triumphant. With Italy secured, its manpower base expanded exponentially. Where once Rome could muster a few thousand soldiers, it could now summon hundreds of thousands drawn from every corner of the peninsula. Its roads connected distant lands. Its colonies secured mountain passes and coastal cities. Its laws, though unequal, kept the peace. It was a republic on the rise. But as Rome looked outward, it saw something it had never faced before. A rival as determined, as disciplined, and as ambitious as itself. Across the sea, the Phoenician city of Carthage ruled the western Mediterranean. It controlled the coasts of North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, southern Spain, and parts of Sicily. Its navy was vast, its merchants rich. Generals, cunning. Rome and Carthage had once been allies, but now their interests clashed. Sicily, fertile, rich, and strategically central, became the flashpoint. The stage was set. Rome had mastered. Italy, now, it would be tested on the seas. The Republic's next war would not be for survival, but for supremacy. It would be fought in every harbor, every island, every shipping lane of the Western world. It would be called the Punic War, and it would change everything. By 264 BC, Rome had conquered the Italian peninsula and carved itself into a unified engine of war, diplomacy, and governance. But to the west, across the shimmering Tyrrhenian Sea, loomed another Titan one, older, richer, and no less hungry for control. Carthage, founded centuries earlier by Phoenician traders from Tyre. Carthage had grown into a maritime powerhouse. Its merchant fleets dominated trade across the Mediterranean. Its wealth flowed from silver mines in Spain, farmlands in Africa, and tribute from subject cities. It fielded vast navies. Its generals hired fierce mercenaries. Its influence extended across Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and deep into Iberia. If Rome was a land empire in its infancy, Carthage was a sea empire at its peak. For decades, the two powers coexisted uneasily. They signed treaties. They avoided conflict. But the balance was delicate. One spark would ignite the greatest war the ancient world had yet seen. That spark was Sicily in 264 BC. A mercenary group called the Mamertines seized the city of Messana in northeastern Sicily. Threatened by the nearby Greek city of Syracuse, the Mamertines asked both Rome and Carthage for help. Carthage arrived first, establishing a garrison, but the Mamertines, untrustworthy and opportunistic, turned to Rome next. The Senate debated. Intervention meant crossing into Carthaginian territory. It was risky. But Sicily, fertile and strategic, was too valuable to ignore, and Roman pride could not tolerate Carthaginian expansion so close to Italy. Rome chose war. Thus began the First Punic War, a 23-year struggle fought by two superpowers over one island. At first, Rome faced a steep disadvantage. Carthage ruled the sea. Its fleets were fast, expertly manned, and decisive. Rome had no navy to speak of. But Rome, as always, adapted after capturing a Carthaginian quinquerema, massive warship with 5 banks of oars. They reverse engineered it. Within months, Rome constructed an entire fleet. And then they did something extraordinary. They added a boarding device, the Corvus's spiked gangplank that dropped onto enemy decks, turning sea battles into land battles, where Roman infantry could dominate. The Corvus turned the tide at the Battle of Mylae in 260 BC. Rome won its first naval victory. Others followed at Salce, Ecnomus, and Tindars. But the war was brutal. Sicily's cities were besieged. Fields were burned. Populations displaced. Both sides suffered horrific losses, not just in battle, but in storms. Entire fleets sank in. Sudden tempest. At one point, Rome lost 100,000 men and 500 ships in a single year. And yet, neither side surrendered. Rome's manpower advantage slowly wore down Carthage. The fleets refitted. Citizens gave more, bled more, endured more. Carthage, reliant on mercenaries, began to strain under cost and revolt. In 241 BC, at the Battle of the Aegates Islands, Rome dealt the final blow. Its rebuilt fleet surprised the Carthaginians, destroyed their ships, and forced peace. Carthage surrendered Sicily, the jewel of the war, and paid a heavy indemnity. The First Punic War was over. Rome had won its first overseas province, but it had also changed. The Republic now ruled people who were not citizens. It had governors who wielded immense, unchecked power far from the city. It had a navy. It had tribute. It had imperial momentum. And Carthage, though beaten, was not broken. It turned to Spain. There, a young general rose, Hamilcar Barca, veteran of the Punic War, swore revenge. His son, Hannibal, was raised in the shadow of Roman betrayal. He was taught that Rome was not a rival, but a curse. Hannibal would remember in 218 BC. He marched from Spain, over the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and across the Alps with elephants, mercenaries, and iron determination. Rome was stunned. The Second Punic War had begun. It would be darker, deadlier, and far more personal at the Battle of Trebia. Then Lake Trasimene, and finally Cannae. Hannibal annihilated Roman armies. Cannae alone saw over 50,000 Romans die in a single day. Panic swept the Republic, but it did not collapse. It adapted again. Rome refused to negotiate. It raised new armies. It fought a war of attrition, avoiding direct confrontation, cutting off Hannibal's allies, starving his supplies. The general who would break the stalemate was Publius Cornelius Scipio. He took the war to Spain, then Africa, and finally, in 202 BC, he faced Hannibal at the Battle of Zama. There, the tide turned. Scipio used Carthage's own tactics, outflanking cavalry, ambushing infantry, and neutralizing elephants with disciplined ranks. Rome won. Carthage sued for peace. It lost its empire, its fleet, and its ability to wage war without Roman consent. Scipio returned to Rome as Scipio Africanusa, savior. But even in victory, Rome remembered humiliation. Decades later, voices in the Senate, especially the aged Cato the elder, demanded the final blow. Carthage had revived economically. Though obedient, it remained a threat. Cato ended every speech with the same phrase: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome declared war against the Third Punic War. But this was no contest. Carthage was besieged, starved, and burned. Its people slaughtered or enslaved. Its seals salted. Its memory erased. Rome had not just defeated its rival, it had annihilated it. The Punic Wars were over. Rome now ruled Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, North Africa, and Spain. Its fleets dominated the sea. Its armies were unmatched, its enemies broken. But in defeating Carthage, Rome had become something new. It was no longer a republic. In practice, it was an empire in everything but name. Its senators governed provinces like kings. Its generals commanded legions with personal loyalty. Its wars were fought not for survival, but for prestige. And within, the Republic was changing. Wealth flooded into Rome. Slave labor replaced small farmers. Latifundia vast, estates devoured land once held by citizens. Urban poverty rose. Political corruption spread. The old virtues were drowned in gold. The Republic had survived kings, class war, and foreign enemies. But could it survive itself? That was the question history would now ask.